The heavy, humid air of Oak Haven clung to the skin, but the silence inside the Copper Bell diner felt even more suffocating. Sheriff Vernon Hargrove had just struck Lillian Gaines, an elderly black woman, for the simple crime of occupying his favorite booth. He expected silence. He expected submission. What he did not expect was a Navy SEAL. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick humidity hanging over Oak Haven, a quiet and forgotten county where life seemed frozen in another era. At the edge of town stood the Copper Bell Diner, a worn establishment known for strong black coffee and peeling vinyl booths. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. More importantly, everyone understood the unwritten rules. Lillian Gaines, a retired school teacher with silver hair neatly pinned back and a kind, weathered face, sat in the corner booth beside the window. She had lived in Oak Haven her entire life. She had taught half the town to read, including several of the men who now wore badges and carried firearms. Lillian was quietly sipping tea and reading a paperback novel. She was bothering no one. The bell above the diner door suddenly jingled with unusual force. Every conversation in the room stopped. Sheriff Vernon Hargrove walked inside. Hargrove was a massive man with a heavy stomach hanging over a wide leather belt. His uniform stretched tightly across his broad shoulders. He had controlled Oak Haven for years through intimidation, secret agreements, and deeply rooted prejudice that he rarely attempted to conceal. Behind him walked his right-hand man, Deputy Colton Reese, a younger officer who imitated his superior's arrogance but lacked his intimidating physical presence. Hargrove stopped inside the entrance and surveyed the room. He enjoyed the silence that followed his arrival. It made him feel like a king inspecting his court. Then he pointed a thick, calloused finger toward the booth beside the window. His booth. The problem was that Lillian Gaines was already sitting there. "Paige," Hargrove barked at the young waitress. Paige flinched at the sound of her name. "Why is someone sitting in my booth?" The waitress held a coffee pot in trembling hands. "Sheriff, Mrs. Gaines only recently sat down. There are plenty of other booths available." "I don't want another booth," Hargrove interrupted. His voice dropped into a low and threatening rumble. He removed his thumbs from his belt and began walking slowly toward Lillian. The diner became completely silent. Forks remained suspended above plates. No one moved. Lillian looked up from her book and adjusted her wireframe glasses. She did not appear frightened. That only enraged Hargrove further. "You need to move," he said, towering above the small table. "This is my booth. It has always been my booth." Lillian offered him a calm and courteous smile. "Good morning, Vernon. I'm afraid I have already ordered my breakfast, and my knees are not as strong as they once were." She gestured gently toward the counter. "Surely you can sit somewhere else on this occasion." Hargrove's face turned a deep, mottled red. He hated hearing his first name spoken in public, especially by a black woman in front of a room filled with people he believed he controlled. He leaned over the table and placed both heavy palms against its surface, invading her personal space. "Listen to me, old woman," Hargrove hissed. The odor of stale tobacco and black coffee rolled from his breath. "You do not tell me what to do in my town." His eyes narrowed. "You do not belong in this booth, and I am tired of looking at you. Get up." Lillian's smile disappeared, but her posture remained perfectly straight. "I am a paying customer, Sheriff Hargrove, and I will leave when I have finished my tea." Her defiance was quiet, but inside the silent diner, it echoed like a gunshot. Hargrove's ego could not tolerate the challenge. Without another word, he drew back his hand and struck her. The backhanded blow landed with a sickening crack. Its force threw Lillian against the window. Her glasses flew from her face and shattered across the checkered linoleum floor. Tea spilled across the table and soaked her dress. A collective gasp swept through the diner. Paige dropped the coffee pot. It shattered, spraying hot liquid across the floor. Lillian raised one hand to her face. Her lip had split and was bleeding while a dark welt was already forming across her cheek. She felt dizzy. Her ears rang from the impact, but she did not cry out. She remained seated, breathless and in pain, staring at the man who had just assaulted her. "The next time I tell you to move," Hargrove sneered as he adjusted his collar, "you move." He behaved as though he had merely swatted away an insect. Then he turned and marched out of the diner. Deputy Reese followed nervously behind him. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as it closed. For several moments, no one moved. Then Paige rushed toward Lillian with tears streaming down her face. She grabbed a handful of napkins and began dabbing at the blood on the older woman's lip. "Mrs. Gaines, oh my God, I am so sorry. Let me call an ambulance." "No," Lillian answered quietly. Her voice trembled, but her resolve remained firm. She gently pushed Paige's hands away and reached into her purse. Her fingers shook as she removed her cell phone. "No ambulance, Paige. Just help me find my spare glasses." While Paige carefully swept away the broken glass, Lillian dialed a number she knew by heart. The call connected. "Hey, Mom." The voice on the other end was deep, calm, and steady. Lillian took a shaky breath and tried to keep the tears from entering her voice. Desmond, sweetheart, are you still in the country? A dust-covered black SUV eventually entered Oak Haven. Desmond Gaines did not look like a man anyone should underestimate. He was built like a cinder block wall and moved with the frighteningly quiet grace of a predator. As a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy SEALs, he had completed multiple combat deployments. Desmond had spent his adult life mastering high-stakes problem-solving in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. But his attention was no longer fixed on a foreign battlefield. It was focused on a sleepy county in Georgia. Desmond parked in the driveway of his mother's modest, single-story home. When he stepped through the front door, he found Lillian sitting in an armchair and knitting. One side of her face was covered in dark purple, yellow, and black bruises. Her lip remained swollen, and she wore an old pair of backup glasses held together with tape. Desmond stopped where he stood. The room suddenly seemed much colder. He did not shout. He did not throw anything. The stillness that settled over him was far more dangerous than any visible explosion of anger. "Mom," Desmond said softly. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. Lillian rested a gentle hand on his broad shoulder. "Desmond, I told you not to leave your base over this. It is only a bruise." "Who did it?" he asked. There was no emotion in his voice. It was a tactical question. Lillian sighed and looked away. "Sheriff Hargrove, it happened at the diner. He wanted my seat, and I did not move quickly enough." She lowered her eyes. "He lost his temper." Lillian squeezed her son's shoulder. "It is over now, Desmond. You cannot fight the police here. You know how Oak Haven works. They protect their own." Desmond slowly stood. "They have not met me yet." He did not immediately drive to the sheriff's department carrying a weapon. That was how amateurs responded. Desmond was a professional. A SEAL did not strike without intelligence, preparation, and a clear understanding of the terrain. His first destination was the Copper Bell Diner. He entered after the busiest part of the day had passed. The restaurant was nearly empty, with only Paige wiping down the counter. She looked up. Her eyes widened when she saw the imposing man standing in the doorway. "Can I get you some coffee?" she asked nervously. "I don't need coffee," Desmond replied as he sat at the counter. "I need to know what happened to Lillian Gaines." Paige froze. She looked toward the kitchen and then back at him. "You're her son, the one in the military?" "Yes." Paige leaned closer and lowered her voice to a whisper. "You need to be careful. Hargrove controls this county. He does whatever he wants." She glanced nervously toward the windows. "He collects protection money from mechanics along Route 9. He takes people's property through fraudulent asset forfeiture cases, and he hurts anyone who speaks against him." "I asked what happened to my mother," Desmond repeated. His unblinking gaze locked onto hers. Paige swallowed and described the entire incident. She told him about Hargrove's arrogance, the unprovoked attack, the sickening sound of the blow, and the way the sheriff had laughed as he walked away. Desmond listened without interrupting and committed every detail to memory. "Do you have security cameras?" he asked, pointing toward a dusty dome mounted in a corner of the ceiling. "We do," Paige whispered, "but Deputy Reese came here afterward and took the hard drive." She looked down. He said it was county evidence connected to a disturbance complaint. "They probably erased everything, Mr. Gaines. There is no proof that it happened." Desmond nodded slowly. Hargrove was covering his tracks like a criminal leader rather than a law enforcement officer, but Desmond understood that arrogance always left evidence behind. A man who felt comfortable assaulting an elderly woman in public was not a criminal mastermind. He was a bully who had never experienced a genuine consequence. "Thank you, Paige," Desmond said. He placed a $50 bill on the counter. "You have been very helpful." Desmond then began an exhaustive reconnaissance operation. He barely rested. From inside his SUV, he observed the sheriff's department and tracked Hargrove's movements. He recorded when the sheriff left his office, where he ate, whom he met, and how many deputies were working at different periods. He learned that Hargrove was deeply controlled by routine. The sheriff regularly attended an illegal private poker game in the rear office of an auto repair shop outside the town limits. The game was funded by the same extortion money he collected from local residents. Desmond also contacted people he trusted. He did not need military support. He needed intelligence. Through a friend working in federal law enforcement, Desmond examined Hargrove's background. He discovered a long record of civil rights complaints that had been buried by a corrupt local judge. He uncovered offshore bank accounts containing money that could never have come from a county sheriff's salary. Desmond assembled a comprehensive dossier, but he knew that simply delivering documents to state authorities would not be enough. Hargrove had political allies. Documents could disappear. Investigations could be delayed. The sheriff needed to be exposed publicly. He needed to lose his authority, dignity, and false sense of invincibility in front of the community he had terrorized. The evening of the poker game arrived beneath heavy clouds threatening rain. Desmond dressed in dark, ordinary clothing. He placed a tactical flashlight inside his pocket and attached several heavy-duty zip ties to his belt. He had no intention of killing Vernon Hargrove. That would have been too easy, and it would have broken his mother's heart. He intended to dismantle him completely. Desmond drove toward the auto repair shop on Route 9. He left the SUV hidden among trees some distance away and approached the building on foot, moving silently through the brush. The front of the shop was dark, but a thin strip of light escaped beneath a heavy steel garage door at the rear. Desmond ignored the main entrance. He examined a side door secured by a strong deadbolt. With the precision of a man who had breached enemy compounds in Kandahar, he removed a tension wrench and lockpick from his pocket. The lock soon clicked open. He entered the dark, grease-stained shop. Distant laughter and clinking glasses echoed from an office farther down the hall. Desmond moved toward the light, prepared to introduce the sheriff of Oakhaven to an entirely different kind of predator. He advanced along the dim hallway without making a sound. The metallic odor of grease mixed with the sharp scent of cigar smoke. Ahead of him, a frosted glass door stood slightly open. Loud, boastful voices spilled through the gap, completely unaware of the approaching danger. Desmond stopped outside the doorway, controlled his breathing, and listened. There were 4 men inside. One voice belonged to Deputy Colton Reese, who was complaining about a poor hand of cards. The booming, arrogant laughter that followed unmistakably belonged to Sheriff Hargrove. Desmond looked through the narrow opening. The room was a makeshift office converted into an illegal gambling den. Stacks of cash lay carelessly across the center of a circular table, surrounded by partially empty bottles of inexpensive whiskey. An open ledger rested on a nearby desk. Its pages contained detailed records of Hargrove's extortion operation. This was the weakness Desmond needed. He pushed the door open. He did not kick it. He did not announce himself. He simply stepped into the room, filling the doorway with his large shadowed figure. The men did not notice him immediately. Reese was focused on shuffling the cards. Hargrove was lighting another thick cigar, the flame briefly illuminating his cruel, fleshy face. The 2 other men were local mechanics who acted as Hargrove's muscle. They were the first to look up. Their drunken amusement immediately turned into stunned confusion. One mechanic instinctively reached for a wrench lying on a nearby counter. Desmond moved. He crossed the room in several powerful strides and seized the mechanic's wrist before the man could lift the tool. With a sharp, practiced movement, Desmond disabled his arm and drove him into the drywall with a muffled groan. The speed of the attack shattered the room's relaxed atmosphere. Chaos erupted. Reese scrambled backward. His chair overturned and sent him crashing onto the linoleum floor. He reached frantically for the firearm inside his holster, but Desmond was already above him. A precise strike against the nerve cluster in Reese's shoulder left the deputy's arm completely useless. Reese screamed and clutched the limp limb, his face pale with shock and pain. The second mechanic charged forward and swung a heavy fist. Desmond slipped effortlessly beneath the clumsy strike and drove his elbow upward into the man's solar plexus. Air exploded from the mechanic's lungs. He collapsed to his knees and gasped helplessly on the floor. Within moments, 3 men had been incapacitated. They groaned and twisted in pain. Only Sheriff Hargrove remained seated. His cigar was frozen halfway to his mouth. His wide eyes stared at the stranger who had dismantled his crew with terrifying efficiency. A heavy silence filled the room. Hargrove finally found his voice, although its usual thunderous authority had vanished. His hand trembled as it moved toward the heavy revolver attached to his leather belt. "Who the hell are you?" he stammered while fumbling with the holster strap. Desmond did not answer immediately. He walked slowly around the table and kicked Reese's fallen weapon into a dark corner. Then he stopped directly in front of Hargrove and stared down at him with cold, unblinking eyes. Before the sheriff could draw his revolver, Desmond's hand shot forward and closed around his thick wrist with crushing force. Hargrove gasped and attempted to pull away. He could not move. The strength of the man holding him was unlike anything he had encountered. Desmond leaned closer. The dim overhead light caught the sharp angles of his face. "I am Lillian Gaines's son," he whispered. His voice was dangerously calm. All color vanished from Hargrove's face. The memory of the elderly woman he had struck flashed through his mind. Then came the horrifying realization of who now stood before him. Hargrove swallowed. A bead of cold sweat moved along his temple. "Listen to me, son," he stammered, attempting to force confidence into his shaking voice. "You do not want to do this." His eyes darted toward the other men. "I am the law in this county. Touching a sworn officer will put you inside a federal prison for the rest of your life." Desmond did not smile. He simply increased the pressure against Hargrove's wrist. A sharp cry escaped the sheriff's throat. With his free hand, Desmond removed the revolver from Hargrove's holster and emptied the ammunition onto the poker table. The polished bullets clattered loudly across the wood. "You are not the law," Desmond replied softly. He threw the empty revolver onto the floor. "You are a coward hiding behind a piece of metal so you can assault elderly women without facing consequences." Desmond released the sheriff's wrist. Then he immediately seized Hargrove by the shirt collar and lifted his massive body from the chair as though he weighed nothing. He slammed the sheriff against the concrete wall. The impact forced the air from Hargrove's lungs. His eyes widened in terror as he struggled to breathe. Desmond removed the heavy-duty zip ties from his belt. He quickly secured Hargrove's hands behind his back. Then he restrained Deputy Reese and both mechanics, leaving all 4 men immobilized on the filthy floor. Hargrove struggled uselessly against the thick plastic restraints. His face turned dark red. "You are making an enormous mistake," he spat. Despite the threat, panic filled his voice. Desmond ignored him and walked toward the desk. He picked up the open ledger and examined the handwritten entries detailing protection payments, bribes, and illegal property seizures. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his jacket. Then he searched the desk drawers. Inside one of them, he discovered a small silver hard drive. It contained the missing security footage from the Copper Bell Diner. Desmond placed it beside the ledger. He now possessed everything he needed. He returned to Hargrove and crouched until they were at eye level. "You're going to walk into the Copper Bell Diner and publicly apologize to my mother in front of the entire town," Desmond instructed. His voice allowed no argument. "Should you fail to appear or attempt to escape, the ledger and this hard drive will go directly to the FBI." His eyes remained fixed on the sheriff. "Do you understand me, Vernon?" Hargrove stared back with rage and profound humiliation burning in his eyes. Eventually, he gave a stiff and reluctant nod. Desmond stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the room. He left the broken men restrained in the darkness. The trap was ready. Oak Haven soon became unusually tense. Word spread rapidly that something significant was going to happen at the Copper Bell Diner. The small restaurant filled beyond capacity. People squeezed into booths, stood against the paneled walls, and crowded around the front counter. Whispered speculation filled the air. Paige remained nervously behind the register, repeatedly wiping the same spotless section of countertop. Lillian Gaines sat in her usual booth beside the window. She wore a crisp floral dress and maintained her dignified posture despite the dark bruising still visible across her face. Desmond stood silently beside her. His arms were folded across his chest. A simple button-down shirt barely concealed his muscular frame, while his eyes examined the room with careful precision. Tension hung heavily in the diner. Then the bell above the entrance rang. The entire restaurant became silent. The crowd slowly separated and created a narrow path. Sheriff Vernon Hargrove entered. He looked nothing like the arrogant tyrant who had terrorized the diner. He was not wearing his perfectly pressed uniform. Instead, he wore wrinkled civilian clothing. One wrist was heavily bandaged, while dark circles surrounded his bloodshot eyes. He appeared pale, defeated, and noticeably smaller. Deputy Reese followed behind him with one arm secured inside a medical sling. Hargrove stopped in the center of the room and swallowed hard. The judgmental gaze of the entire town pressed down upon him. He looked toward the corner booth where Lillian sat quietly. His hands tightened into fists. The silence continued, heavy with expectation as everyone waited for the corrupt sheriff to surrender his pride. "Say it," Desmond commanded. His deep voice carried effortlessly across the crowded diner. Hargrove flinched. He took a hesitant step forward and desperately searched the room for a sympathetic expression. There were none. He looked down at his scuffed boots. Then he slowly forced himself to meet Lillian's calm and forgiving eyes. "Lillian," Hargrove rasped. His voice was rough and painfully quiet. "I am deeply sorry for what I did to you." He struggled to continue. "It was wrong. I lost control of my temper and I had absolutely no right to put my hands on you." Hargrove lowered his gaze. "I apologize." The words tasted like ash. For a man controlled entirely by ego, the public humiliation was unbearable. A quiet murmur spread throughout the diner. Residents exchanged stunned looks. The sheriff they had once considered invincible had finally been brought to his knees. Lillian nodded slowly. Her expression remained serene. "I accept your apology, Vernon," she replied gracefully. "But an apology does not erase a crime," Desmond interrupted. He stepped forward and removed the small silver hard drive from his jacket. Hargrove's eyes widened with panic. "You promised," he hissed desperately. "I did what you demanded. I apologized." Desmond stared at him with absolute cold detachment. "I said I would contact the FBI should you refuse to appear." His voice remained even. "I never said I would not contact them after you did." Desmond reached into his pocket again and removed a sleek black smartphone. He did not need to place a call. The screen showed that a conversation was already active. Desmond activated the speaker. A crisp, authoritative voice filled the diner. "Special Agent Julian Cross, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlanta Field Office." The agent's voice hardened. "Sheriff Hargrove, remain exactly where you are." Before Hargrove could react, the sound of sirens tore through the atmosphere outside. Red and blue lights flashed intensely across the diner's large windows. Unmarked black federal SUVs and state police cruisers surrounded the parking lot, blocking every possible escape route. Hargrove stumbled backward. His face lost all color. He looked toward Reese, who was already quietly crying into his uninjured hand. The diner doors burst open. A tactical team of heavily armed federal agents entered, their equipment standing in stark contrast to the small-town surroundings. Special Agent Julian Cross, a tall man in a sharply tailored gray suit, walked calmly behind them. He approached Hargrove and removed a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Vernon Hargrove," Cross announced firmly, "you are under arrest for extortion, grand larceny, evidence tampering, and the brutal assault of an elderly citizen." He pointed toward the floor. "Turn around." Hargrove did not resist. The fight had completely disappeared from him. He slowly turned and allowed the federal agent to secure his wrists tightly behind his back. As the disgraced sheriff was escorted toward the exit, thunderous applause erupted throughout the diner. The people of Oak Haven clapped, cheered, and celebrated the final end of a long and terrifying era of corruption. Paige wiped tears of relief from her cheeks. Desmond quietly watched the federal vehicles leave. His rigid posture finally relaxed slightly. Then he turned toward the booth. His mother smiled warmly at him. Lillian reached out and gently held his large, calloused hands between hers. "You did a good thing, Desmond," she whispered proudly. "You protected our home." Desmond squeezed her hands affectionately. A rare and genuine smile touched his lips. "No one hurts my mother," he replied softly. "No one." Desmond remained in Oak Haven long enough to repair the porch, care for the garden, and ensure that his mother fully recovered. The bruising eventually disappeared from Lillian's face, replaced by the radiant and dignified expression she had always possessed. Oak Haven slowly began to heal, an honest sheriff was appointed, and corrupt deputies were removed from the department. The Copper Bell Diner became livelier than ever. Genuine laughter replaced the frightened whispers that had once filled the room. Desmond eventually packed his dusty black SUV. After giving his mother one final tight embrace, he began the drive back toward his naval base. He left knowing that the darkness of corruption had been burned away. Oak Haven was safe again, protected by the enduring courage of a mother and the unwavering devotion of her son. The story of the Navy SEAL who dismantled a corrupt empire through intelligence and profound love would remain part of the town's history forever. The story of Lillian Gaines and her son Desmond proves that true power does not come from a badge or intimidation. It comes from the courage to remain standing and the fierce love of family. No bully is invincible. Justice always finds a path. If this powerful story of a Navy SEAL defending his mother inspired you, press the like button, share the video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, true-to-life stories.